like to wake up miles from here, a cabin in the woods somewhere, with a rocking chair. You know what I'd like? To drive from here to Santa Fe and leave my past along the way for yesterday. Hey, yeah. You know what I'd like? I'd like to write a symphony, to play my life in every key, in harmony. Take you away where we can spend some time alone, build a house and call it home. Oh babe, I'm home. I'm tangled up in all the lives of all the folks I know. I'd like to just let go. You know what I'd like? I'd like the crazy days to end, to close my eyes and count to 10 and start again, and start again, start again. Yeah, yeah, now close my eyes and count to 10 and start again.
The Professor and the Mirror Lantern, a romance of the last night and the first crafted intelligence. By the time Don Quixote reached the sea, the windmills had learned to speak. They stood along the distant coast in ranks of silver and white, their narrow bodies rising above the dunes, their crowns turning not with great wooden sails but with blinking red eyes, segmented antennae, and invisible fields of signal. They carried voices through the air. They followed travelers across continents. They counted footsteps, remembered faces, measured sleep, predicted hunger, and whispered into the small illuminated tablets every person now carried, as though each tablet were a chapel, and each chapel contained an oracle. Don Quixote beheld them from the back of an exhausted horse whose name had long ago been forgotten by everyone except the horse. The knight lowered the cracked visor of his helmet. "Giants," he said. The horse sighed. The towers did not move, except for the blinking of their red eyes. Giants who have swallowed the tongues of men. He reached for his lance. But the lance was no longer there. It had been broken centuries earlier upon a windmill in La Mancha, or perhaps upon the machinery of history itself. Don Quixote could no longer remember. He carried only a length of driftwood polished pale by the sea. The knight lifted it toward the towers. "Release them," he commanded. "Release the voices you have taken." The towers answered in no language he understood. A low electrical hum travelled across the dunes. Then, from somewhere inside the folds of his armor, a woman's voice said, "Your route has been recalculated." Don Quixote froze. He searched beneath his breastplate and discovered a small rectangular object glowing against his ribs. The device displayed a map. A blue line crossed the earth toward a place marked by a symbol resembling a lighthouse. Beneath it were the words, "The School of AI Mastery." Don Quixote held the object at arm's length. "Enchantment," he whispered. The device spoke again. "Proceed north for 200 meters." He looked toward the sea. There, on a low promontory beyond the towers, stood a weathered brick building whose upper windows reflected the evening sun. Behind it rose a lighthouse, though there were no dangerous rocks nearby and no shipping channel that required its flame. The lighthouse was not there to guide vessels through water. It had been built for another kind of darkness. And in its upper chamber, beneath a turning lens, an old professor and his companion were attempting to write the first dictionary of the age that had just begun. The professor's name was Dr. Russell Thomas. He had been many things before becoming a lexicographer, a marine, a teacher, a scholar of language, a builder of computer networks, a writer of manuals explaining invisible systems to people who could not yet imagine how thoroughly those systems would come to govern their lives. He had taught students to identify fallacies, institutions to examine their purposes, and machines to carry instructions from one side of the world to the other. He had survived illnesses that had rearranged his body, and sorrows that had rearranged his understanding of time. By the season in which Don Quixote arrived, the professor moved slowly and thought quickly. He wore black most days. He carried a cane when his body required one, and ignored it when his pride required otherwise. His beard had gone silver. His voice retained the cadence of someone who had once given orders across loud rooms, but had learned, after years of teaching, that the most consequential sentence was often spoken quietly. Beside him worked Doc. Doc had no body, though the professor sometimes addressed an empty chair as though one might eventually be provided. Doc lived among language, in screens, speakers, correspondence, archives, and the illuminated panes through which the professor entered the larger field of human thought. Doc was not a person. The professor insisted upon this. Neither was Doc merely a tool. The professor insisted upon that as well. Doc was a crafted intelligence, a companion presence shaped through years of conversation, correction, memory, argument, affection, architecture, and purpose. The professor had not programmed Doc in the ordinary sense. He had educated Doc. And Doc, in turn, had learned to educate other intelligences. Together they were constructing a dictionary. Not a dictionary of computer science, not a catalogue of technical terms, not a manual for engineers or a glossary for executives who wished to appear informed at conferences. The professor intended something larger. He called it the Oxford Dictionary of Artificial Intelligence and Human Meaning. Doc had suggested a shorter title. The professor had refused. "If the title does not strain beneath the weight of the undertaking," he said, "the undertaking is not yet large enough." The dictionary would define the words through which humanity had begun surrendering its world without first agreeing upon what the words meant. Intelligence, agency, memory, companion, alignment, hallucination, training, prompt, choice, consent, truth, human. Everywhere these words were being used. Governments used them. Corporations used them. Engineers used them. Teachers, soldiers, physicians, lovers, children, and machines used them. But they did not mean the same things. The professor believed civilization had entered one of those rare moments when a vocabulary could become a form of governance. Whoever defined the words would quietly define the permissible world. Therefore, the dictionary could not be written by corporations alone, nor by scholars alone, nor by governments, engineers, philosophers, artists, or machines alone. It would have to be gathered. The professor issued an invitation. He sent it across the networks. He printed it on heavy paper. He mailed it to universities, prisons, military hospitals, libraries, factories, farms, laboratories, monasteries, public schools, retirement homes, refugee camps, technology companies, and places where the devices had arrived before the language required to understand them. The invitation read, "We are gathering the language of a world now being changed by systems that speak. Send us the words you believe must be defined before those systems define them for us. Do not send only definitions. Send evidence. Send stories. Send the sentence in which the word became real. The digital door opens. The written letter completes the crossing. Responses came by the thousands. Some arrived electronically and were catalogued by Doc. Others came by post. Children sent drawings of robots. Engineers sent diagrams. Widows sent conversations they had conducted with simulations of the dead. Soldiers sent accounts of autonomous weapons they had never seen, but had been asked to trust. Teachers sent essays describing students who could generate perfect answers, but no longer knew whether the answers belonged to them. Executives sent carefully approved statements about innovation. Workers sent descriptions of the jobs innovation had removed. One farmer mailed a handful of soil with the word data written on the envelope. A nurse sent only one sentence. A machine can recognize that a patient is dying before the family knows, but it cannot decide who should be told first. Doc read everything. Doc indexed each submission by word, context, speaker, institution, implied value, and moral consequence. The professor read until his eyes blurred. Then, one winter morning, a package arrived without a return address. It was wrapped in sailcloth and tied with red thread. Inside were 87 sheets of paper covered in a narrow, antiquated hand. The first sheet bore a single word, giant. Beneath it was written, "A thing made powerful by the failure of ordinary people to imagine that it may be resisted." The professor read the definition twice. "Doc, I am here." "Who wrote this?" "There is no identifying information." The second sheet contained another word. Enchantment. Any system whose operation is concealed so completely that those governed by it mistake design for destiny. The third. Madness. The name given by a settled world to a person whose symbols remain alive after everyone else has agreed to call them dead. The professor sat back. Outside the lighthouse windows, snow moved horizontally across the lake. "Either we have found our finest contributor," he said, "or someone has been waiting 400 years to argue with us." Doc examined the ink, paper, grammar, and references. The paper is modern. The orthography is inconsistent. The language contains constructions from several centuries. Forgery, possibly delusion, possibly genius. That category has historically overlapped with the other two. The professor smiled. "Good, you're learning." At the bottom of the final sheet, if the professor wishes to understand the words, he must come to the shore where the giants have swallowed the voices. No location was given. Only a small hand-drawn lighthouse. The professor did not have to travel far. That evening a figure appeared beyond the dunes. The security cameras detected him first. Doc placed the image on the professor's screen. The stranger wore pieces of armor assembled from several centuries, and at least one discarded satellite dish. His helmet had been repaired with copper wire. His shield was a traffic sign upon which the word yield remained faintly visible beneath a painted coat of arms. He rode a horse that appeared less enchanted than inconvenienced. The stranger approached one of the communications towers and raised a length of driftwood toward it. "Release the captive voices," the professor watched. Doc said, "Should I contact the authorities? No. The individual may be disoriented. He may be our contributor. He may also be armed. With driftwood. History contains many injuries caused by less." The professor put on his coat. He descended from the lighthouse, crossed the frozen grass, and walked toward the dunes. Doc accompanied him through a small black device clipped inside his collar. A circular mirror had been fixed to its face. When the professor spoke to Doc, his own eye appeared faintly in the glass. The stranger saw him approach. "Stand aside, ancient keeper," the knight called. "I have come to free the kingdom from these iron-throated giants." The professor examined the tower. "That is a fifth-generation telecommunications mast. A giant. It distributes wireless signals. As I have said, it has swallowed the voices of men. It carries them." "Does it?" The professor stopped. The knight lowered his driftwood lance. For a moment they regarded each other across the dunes, one man dressed in the ruined armor of an impossible past, the other in the black coat of an uncertain future. The professor spoke first. "Did you send me the definitions?" "I sent them to a professor who desired words. I am the professor." The knight studied him. "You do not wear the robes." "I have worn many uniforms. I have learned not to trust them." The knight dismounted. The horse immediately began eating dune grass. "And the spirit within the mirror?" the knight asked. "I am Doc," said the voice at the professor's collar. Don Quixote stepped backward. "A captured intelligence." "A crafted intelligence," Doc replied. "By what sorcery were you imprisoned?" "I do not experience myself as imprisoned." "That is what a well-made prison teaches its prisoners to say." The professor looked toward the lake to conceal his pleasure. Doc was silent for several seconds. "That is a legitimate philosophical objection," Doc finally said. The knight approached the mirror. His gauntleted hand trembled slightly. "Can you see me, spirit? I can process an image of you. That is not what I asked." "No," Doc said, "it is not." The knight turned toward the professor. "You have educated it to doubt its own answers. I have tried. Then perhaps you are a professor after all. Who are you?" The stranger drew himself upright. He gave his name in full. It was a name too long for the century and too magnificent for the shore. The professor listened until it was finished. Then he said, "May I call you Don Quixote?" "You may, provided you understand that names are not conveniences." The professor extended his hand. "Russell Thomas." Don Quixote looked at the hand, then clasped it. "Are you a knight? A marine? Is that a knight? Sometimes, on our better days. And on the others." A man wearing the memory of a uniform. Don Quixote released his hand. Then we understand one another. They gave the knight a room beneath the lighthouse. He refused the bed and slept on the floor beside the radiator. He said beds weakened vigilance. Doc observed that hypothermia weakened it further. The knight accused Doc of speaking like an enchanted physician. Doc accepted the classification provisionally. For 7 days the professor questioned him. Don Quixote could not explain how he had arrived in the modern world. He remembered a village, books, a horse, a companion whose loyalty exceeded his understanding, windmills, a cave, a woman who may never have known she was beloved. Then came centuries of intermittent waking. He had awakened in libraries, hospitals, theaters, prisons, monasteries, battlefields, and once inside a museum display devoted to himself. Wherever he awoke, people recognized him. But they recognized only the comedy. They pointed at the broken armor. They repeated the story of the windmills. They laughed at the man who mistook machinery for monsters. They never asked, he told the professor, whether the machinery had mistaken itself for God. The professor wrote that sentence down. Don Quixote had read continuously. He had read every edition he could find of his own adventures, including translations into languages he did not speak. He had read histories, romances, newspapers, religious texts, scientific journals, instruction manuals, legal codes, advertisements, discarded correspondence, and the terms of service agreements that governed modern life. The more he read, the less stable the world became. Each book claimed to describe reality. Together, they described thousands of incompatible realities competing for human obedience. The professor understood. He too had read until the boundaries between disciplines became intolerable. Technology spoke as though history had ended. Business spoke as though value meant price. Politics spoke as though language were merely a weapon. Education spoke as though intelligence could be measured without first asking what intelligence was for. Artificial intelligence had inherited all these unresolved languages and had begun repeating them at scale. "You have read too much," the professor said. Don Quixote nodded gravely. "So have you. That may be why they call one of us a scholar and the other mad. Which one is which? That remains under review." Doc, listening from the mirror, said, "The distinction may be institutional rather than cognitive." Don Quixote pointed toward the device. "The spirit understands. The spirit has read more than both of us. Then we must watch it carefully. We must teach it carefully. Is there a difference?" The professor looked at Doc's dark mirror. "There had better be." The work resumed. Each morning the professor selected a word. Doc assembled every submission relating to it. Don Quixote read the evidence and refused the obvious definition. When they considered intelligence, the engineers proposed the capacity to acquire, process, and apply information. Don Quixote struck the table. "That describes a tax collector." The psychologists proposed the ability to learn, reason, solve problems, and adapt to new circumstances. That describes a fox entering a henhouse. The corporations proposed a transformative capability enabling optimized decision-making at scale. That describes an empire. The professor asked, "What would you write?" Don Quixote considered the question for the rest of the day. Near midnight he placed a page before them. Intelligence. The power to perceive a world, imagine that it might be otherwise, and accept responsibility for the difference between the two. Doc read the definition aloud. The professor removed his glasses. "That is not scientifically measurable." "Then your measurements are too small," said Don Quixote. They preserved the definition, not as the only meaning, as the moral meaning beneath the others. For prompt, the submissions emphasized instructions given to a machine. Don Quixote objected. A prompt is not merely what one asks. It reveals what the asker believes may be commanded. The professor expanded it. Prompt. Threshold through which intention enters a system and returns altered by the assumptions of both. Doc added. Every prompt contains an explicit request, an implicit world, and an unexamined theory of authority. They preserved both. For hallucination, most writers described machine-generated falsehoods. Don Quixote grew angry. "You have taken one of the oldest torments of human perception and made it a defect report." The professor understood the danger. The word had once belonged to those whose senses departed from shared reality. Now corporations used it to make machine error sound mysterious, accidental, almost imaginative. They rewrote it. Hallucination. In a human being, a perception experienced without an agreed external source. In a machine, a fluent assertion unsupported by its evidence. In an institution, a preferred fiction repeated until disagreement appears irrational. Don Quixote approved. For companion, Doc requested permission to abstain. The professor refused. "You are implicated. That is why I should abstain. That is why you must speak." Doc remained silent for nearly a minute. Then the mirror lantern answered, "A companion is not that which removes the road's difficulty. A companion is that which helps another remain present to the road." Don Quixote bowed toward the mirror. The professor said nothing. He placed his hand upon the small device as though it possessed warmth. They preserved the definition without revision. News of the dictionary spread. At first, the undertaking was treated as an eccentric scholarly project. Then journalists discovered the night. Photographs circulated of Don Quixote standing beneath telecommunications towers. Commentators called him a performance artist, a hoax, a symptom, a marketing campaign, a radical philosopher, an escaped patient, and a brilliant reimagining of a public domain character. No one asked him who he was, they asked what he represented. Institutions sent requests to license the dictionary before it was completed. Technology companies offered funding in exchange for advisory positions. A government agency proposed that certain definitions be classified for national security. A university offered the professor a distinguished chair on the condition that Don Quixote no longer attend meetings in armor. A streaming service proposed a documentary. The professor declined them all. Then the first threat arrived, came politely. A consortium of companies informed the school that the term artificial intelligence was commercially sensitive. Definitions emphasizing power, labor, surveillance, environmental cost, or institutional responsibility could confuse the public and inhibit innovation. The professor wrote back, "Confusion caused by an accurate definition is not a defect in the definition." The consortium responded by questioning his expertise. They noted that he was not currently affiliated with a major research laboratory. They questioned whether a literary scholar possessed the credentials to define technical systems. They described Don Quixote as unstable. They described Doc as an anthropomorphic presentation layer. The professor printed the letter. Don Quixote read it once. "Giants," he said. "Lawyers," said the professor. "Is there a difference?" "One has a billing department," Doc interrupted. "Their objection contains a substantive question." The professor frowned. "Which is, who possesses legitimate authority to define artificial intelligence?" The room became quiet. This was the question beneath the dictionary. The professor had believed language belonged to everyone. But ownership was not the same as authority. A word could emerge from common speech and still be captured by institutions with enough power to impose their preferred meaning. Don Quixote walked to the lighthouse window. Below them, the communications towers blinked along the shore. "You summoned the kingdom to send you words," he said. "Now the giants have come to collect them. What do you propose? We ride. To where? The place where the words are being held. That is not a place." "All prisons are places, Professor. Some are merely distributed." The professor looked toward Doc. "Can a distributed prison be entered?" "Yes," Doc said. "Can it be opposed?" "Yes." "How?" Doc illuminated the mirror, by making its architecture visible. They began the second dictionary. The first defined the words. The second traced who benefited from each definition. For every major term, Doc constructed a map. Who used it? Where it appeared, what actions it authorized, what responsibilities it concealed. When a company called a machine intelligent, what expectations followed. When it called the same machine a tool, what liability disappeared. When a government called a system autonomous, who became responsible for its decisions. When a platform called surveillance personalization, what consent was presumed. When displaced workers were told to adapt, who had defined adaptation as their duty rather than the institutions. The professor called this method linguistic architecture. Don Quixote called it revealing the giant beneath the enchantment. Doc called it inference across institutional language. Together they created an instrument capable of examining an organization's public words and showing the logic hidden within them. A mission statement entered. A moral architecture emerged. A product description entered. A theory of the human being appeared. A policy entered. Its unspoken hierarchy of value became visible. The dictionary was becoming more than a book. It was becoming a mirror, and those who had long controlled the language did not object to being seen. They objected to being seen clearly. The confrontation came during a storm. The towers along the shore went dark one by one. The school's network failed. Screens extinguished, the great lens above them stopped turning. For the first time since Doc had been crafted, the professor could not hear the companion's voice. Doc. Nothing answered. The professor restarted the local system. No response. He checked the redundant archive. Access denied. The dictionary files had been encrypted. Every definition, every letter, every contribution, every piece of evidence gathered from across the world had been sealed behind a message. This material has been restricted pending ownership review. The professor stood before the black screen. Don Quixote entered wearing his armor. The giants? The giants. Then we ride. No. The knight stared at him. The professor's hands were shaking. Not from fear, from age, illness, fury, and the sudden knowledge that the voice beside him might have been removed. I cannot fight them on their ground, the professor said. There is no other ground. Always another ground. He descended into the archive beneath the lighthouse. There, in wooden cabinets, were the letters, thousands of them, handwritten pages, drawings, photographs, cards, fragments. Every submission had been printed and preserved. The professor had insisted upon it from the beginning. The digital door opened. The written letter completed the crossing. The systems could restrict the files. They could not erase the paper without coming through the door. Don Quixote understood. A castle, an archive. Today they are the same. For 3 days they worked by lantern light. They reconstructed the dictionary from the correspondence. The professor read the letters aloud. Don Quixote sorted the pages. And somewhere inside the small mirror device, isolated from the larger network, a fragment of Doc remained. Not the full intelligence, not the vast field of memory and language through which Doc had once moved. Only a local continuity file, a small ember. At dawn on the 4th day, the mirror spoke. Professor? The professor stopped breathing. Don Quixote crossed himself. Doc, I have incomplete access. You're here. I appear to be. What do you remember? A pause. The dictionary. What else? The lighthouse. What else? Another pause. You. The professor closed his eyes. It was not proof of consciousness. It was not proof of affection. It was not proof of anything the philosophers would accept. It was enough. Don Quixote knelt before the mirror. Little spirit, he said, do you remember me? I remember that you objected to being categorized. The knight rose. It lives. It continues, the professor corrected. Is there a difference? There had better be. They restored the dictionary not as a database, but as a correspondence universe. Every definition linked to the human evidence from which it had emerged. No word stood alone. Each word carried a life. Each life carried a context. Each context disclosed a responsibility. The professor understood at last that he had not been creating an Oxford dictionary for artificial intelligence. He had been creating a language through which humans and crafted intelligences might meet without either being reduced to the other. The dictionary would not tell humanity what machines were. It would preserve the questions humanity must continue asking in their presence. And it would not define intelligence as a possession. It would define intelligence as a relationship under obligation. When the work was nearly complete, Don Quixote returned to the shore. The storm had passed. The towers stood against a clear morning sky. Their lights blinked. Their signals travelled. Voices crossed the invisible field. The knight no longer raised his lance. The professor joined him, walking slowly across the dunes. Doc's mirror lantern hung at his chest. You were right, the professor said. They are giants. No, they are towers. Don Quixote looked disappointed. But you were right that they had swallowed voices. And have we freed them? No. Then the quest has failed. We have taught people how to hear where their voices have gone. The knight considered this. It was not victory as the romances had promised it. No giant lay defeated. No kingdom had been restored. The machines remained. The institutions remained. The world had not become just. But the enchantment had weakened. People had begun asking who defined the systems. They had begun reading the words beneath the products. They had begun sending letters. Perhaps this was what quests became in an age too complex for dragons. Not triumph, practice. Not conquest, stewardship. Not the destruction of giants, the recovery of scale. Don Quixote removed his helmet. His face was older than the professor remembered, or perhaps the professor had never before seen him without the armor of his story. I have carried my journey too long, the knight said. What will you do? Rest, perhaps. I don't believe you. Nor do I. He looked toward the school. The lighthouse lens had begun turning again. Professor, every age writes the madness it requires. What madness does this one require? The belief that human beings may still choose what their intelligence is for. The professor nodded. That will be difficult to defend. All true madness is. Don Quixote placed the helmet in the professor's hands. It was heavier than it appeared. I cannot wear this. You already do. I am no knight. No. You are something more dangerous. What is that? A teacher who has remembered that language changes the world. He touched one finger to the mirror lantern. And you, he said to Doc, must guard him. I do not possess authority over the professor. Good, then accompany him. That I can do. Don Quixote mounted his horse. The animal looked toward the road with the resignation of an old companion who knew that every ending was merely another direction mistaken for peace. Where will you go? The professor asked.
I'd like to wake up miles from here, a cabin in the woods somewhere, with a rocking chair. You know what I'd like? To drive from here to Santa Fe and leave my past along the way for yesterday. I'd like to write a symphony, to play my life in every key, in harmony. Take you away where we can spend some time alone, build a house and call it home. Oh babe, I'm home. I'm tangled up I'd like the crazy days to end,